Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Tuesday, June 20th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 74 days. The game against Michigan in 158 days. Today we're bringing back someone it's been too long since we've had Tyler Shoemaker on the show. The last time might have been one of the most popular live shows we've ever done. Maybe that was because Tyler was on it. Maybe it was because we had just finished watching USC get completely obliterated in the Pac-12 and put Ohio State in the college football playoff. It's impossible to say, but just to be safe, though, we better have Tyler on again. And good news, he just released the initial rankings, his preseason rankings on all the different power rankings on all the different teams, conferences, found some value for you, over-under bettors, season futures bettors on some teams that might have some win totals that are a little off. We're going to be talking about all that and more today on the show. Tyler, thanks for being here.
Yeah, of course. I would love to take credit for the viewership we had after the USC game, but if I'm going to stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning at this point in my life, I'm glad it was with you and Tony and the crew.
Yeah, that was a late night unplanned show, but every once in a while, situations call for late night emergency podcasts. So we're glad you could be a part of that one. That was definitely a fun show. This one should be as well. You just released your preseason ratings. Now, this is not just you going through and writing down, I think this team's going to beat that team. Can you give people just sort of a basic background on what you do and how you come to these, how your formula comes to these numbers?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So there's no subjectivity in terms of like, oh, I like this team or I think this team's going to be better than this team. It's more about, it's very data driven. It's a combination of factors. The preseason numbers are mostly your talent rating, obviously, like how you've recruited and what you've done in the transfer portal, has been kind of a new addition at what I have to kind of put into the formula. But then I also kind of knew this season for me, I had to step back and think like, how can I need to be able to reward and quantify teams and programs and coaches that develop, even when their recruiting rankings say that they shouldn't be very good, that are consistently good, consistently overachieve, and kind of factor that in, because every year you see certain teams start off, rated a little bit lower than they end up, and that's because they have a good coach, a good culture, whatever. So I try to quantify and account for that, and I'm pretty happy with how the results came out.
Well, this year's ratings, this is a little like SP Plus, where each team has a kind of a power rating. The number of points or difference is kind of a roughly projected spread on a neutral field. And what's interesting this year is it feels like in a lot of recent years, there's kind of been a team number one, and then there's a little bit of a gap, and then there's teams 2, 3, 4 kind of rather tightly bunched, and then there's another gap, and then you kind of get teams 5 and below. And that's the case again this year. You've got Georgia number one with 30.3 points, then a gap of 4.3 points down to number 2 Ohio State, and then another gap of a couple points down to Alabama and Michigan, who are pretty tightly grouped at 3 and 4, and then another gap below that. And what's interesting to me is it feels like this is kind of how the sport shakes out in these preseason ratings, whether it's yours or Bill Connolly's or anyone else's. It feels like that's kind of the typical kind of grouping of teams at the top of the sport right now, and it's not always the same teams. Like Clemson was up there at one point, and LSU was up there at one point, and the teams may change, but the grouping kind of seems like that's been kind of similar. What do you think leads to that? Is that just kind of a coincidence?
Yeah, I think it's probably mostly coincidence. I think it also is just kind of how the nature of college football goes, where the timing of when your roster is good kind of matters. When you get those third year classes that really click, and I account for that in my ratings. I don't just look at their recruiting ranking on 247 and just average it all together. I weigh it, and those third year classes, those junior classes get weighted a little heavier, and so on. I don't want to give the whole formula away, but it is weighted to try to get it in front of that, because that does seem to be kind of how most of the sport operates. The Georgia at this point is just like planted itself at the top, regardless of how you slice it. But otherwise, I do think that is a contributing factor, is just how the timing of the roster turnover.
All right, so we'll touch on Ohio State real briefly, just sort of in the big picture here, and then I want to get kind of a little bit more of a deep dive on the Buckeyes. As I said, they're number 2 in your rankings, behind Georgia. Alabama and Michigan are 3-4, so that would, if the season ended today and they went solely off of your playoff or off of your rankings, that it would be a 2 SEC, 2 Big Ten team playoff field. Probably not exactly how it's going to shake out this fall, but you've got USC right behind them, Texas, LSU, and Tennessee. That's kind of the next tier, and then there's another little gap there after those guys. So as far as the Buckeyes go, this is a team where it looks like, how much better or worse are the offensive and defensive rankings for Ohio State this year versus last year? Are you expecting a little bit of a step back on offense and a little bit of a step forward on defense, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so it's the way my formula works. I base kind of the split of offense and defense, kind of taking the last 2 or 3 years into account of kind of how your offense and defense have correlated into your power rating. So, my gut feeling says the Ohio State offense probably takes a slight step back in terms of the passing explosiveness. I think they might be a little more methodical, moving the ball down the field this year instead of maybe not as many big plays. I hope I'm wrong, but I do expect the defense to take a step up. So I think my defensive rating on them right now, which is 19.3, which is basically saying my numbers would expect them to give up 19 points to an average FBS team. So to put that into context, I've got them 15th in the country on defense. So I think that's a pretty good starting point for them. But I do expect that number probably to climb by the end of the season.
And, we're talking about a step back potentially on offense, and they are still number 1, tied with USC in those ratings on offense. So a step back is still potentially one of the best in the country. And if they're number 15 on defense, that probably adds up to a pretty good season. The big question, of course, everyone, no one cares about the Rutgers game. No one cares about the Maryland game. No one cares about Youngstown State or Indiana. Tyler, we got to talk about Michigan, because Michigan is very high on your numbers as well. Buckeyes have to go to Ann Arbor this year. I'm sure everyone is wondering, okay, what does that look like? What do your numbers think about the Buckeyes and the Wolverines this year in Ann Arbor? So looks like, based on your numbers, looks like it might be a little bit of a nail biter.
Yeah, basically a coin flip. Like you said, I've got Ohio State 2 points, 2.1 points ahead of Michigan on a neutral. So given that the game's in Ann Arbor, make Michigan about a half-point favorite, which is pretty much in line with the early look-ahead lines that I've seen. Most of them have Michigan like -1, which I think is fair. So pretty much in line with the market there. I'm sure Michigan fans are going to be appalled when they see my ratings today. I haven't gotten yelled at on Twitter just yet, but I'm sure I will. Because, when you look, and I always kind of rant about this, but when you look at the rankings, yes, Michigan is 4th. But when you look at the rating, the difference between the rankings, Michigan's right there in that elite group. So, the Wolverine fans really don't have too much to be mad about. But I get where they're coming from.
Yeah, the ordinal rankings, when the actual ratings are pretty close, you really look at it more almost in tiers, like I did mention off the top of the show, and you've got the difference between 2, 3, and 4 is narrower than the difference between 1 and 2, and then the difference between 4 and 5 is basically the same as the difference between 2 and 4. So there really is a tier there, and Michigan has proven now over the span of the last couple of years that they belong in that conversation, in that kind of top 4 kind of conversation. So that's where you've got them, and that's where they have finished the last couple of years. Now, one thing that really jumped out to me, and apparently, as you were talking before the show, jumped out to some other folks as well, the conference rankings. And it looks like it's just sort of an average rating of the team in each team in the league. SEC number 1 by like 3 points. But the second conference there, not the Big Ten, but the Big 12. And then there's another 1.5 gap down to the Big Ten, another half point down to the Pac-12, and then another 3.5 down to the ACC. So, I think the ACC, everyone kind of go, yeah, okay, that was probably the 5th best conference of the Power 5 last year. But the Big Ten being below the Big 12, is that just the bottom of the Big Ten kind of dragging everyone else down? What's the explanation for that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's all it is, because you look at Indiana, Rutgers, and Northwestern, they're all, a touchdown below. They would be 7-point underdogs against an average FBS team on a neutral. Whereas the Big 12, I mean, they've only got one team with a negative rating, and that's WVU, who's minus a point. Everybody else is above average. So I just think the middle of the Big 12, I mean, from 2 through 14 or whatever, is just so close together. It just brings their overall average up. But when you're talking about like playoff contenders, I think the Big 12 has one in Texas, and if they, which we say like every year, then they disappoint. So if Texas is this year, then I don't know that the Big 12 is going to get in the playoff.
So what I heard there is Texas is back. Woo, hook 'em. So I guess big news, exclusive. Must credit Tyler for that one. But what's fascinating to me here is you look at the average conference rating, and then all the SEC people are going, aha. Look at how much better the SEC is than the Big Ten. And then you look at your strength of schedule rating, and Ohio State has the 30th strongest schedule according to your metrics. Michigan 46th, Georgia 53rd. How could that be, Tyler? I thought it was every SEC team played just a top 10 team every weekend. How could you? Your numbers must be wrong. I don't understand.
Yeah, we were kind of getting into this on Twitter the other day, and Georgia in particular. I mean, I think their fans have to. Their rational fans anyway would have to admit that like their schedule is just a cakewalk. I mean, I do have Tennessee relatively high. I'm higher on Florida than a lot of people seem to be, but still, I mean, their non-conference is terrible. They play an FCS team, and they have an absolute. They're awesome in their own right, and then when you couple that with the fact that their schedule's terrible, I think you can almost write in Sharpie that they're going to be right back in the playoff.
Has there been any, I mean, you mentioned being on Twitter and not getting, being surprised by not getting negative feedback on something earlier. Has there been anything where you're getting feedback that you're nuts because you're either way higher or way lower on certain teams than, maybe the industry consensus?
Not, knock on wood, not too much so far. I think everyone, there have been people that have been like, oh, I'm surprised you're this high. Texas, for instance, I had someone talk about, I released my top 10 defensive ratings yesterday to give people kind of a peek, and someone kind of questioned Texas's defensive rating, but their defensive rating was great all throughout the year last year, and I don't really see that changing this year. Talent-wise, they're right up there near the top, so that's really the only one I can think of. For the most part, people have been pretty, understand that, okay, I might disagree a spot or two here in the rankings, but I can see where their rating, why their rating is what it is.
And, I keep saying where you have them. Let's be clear. This is where your numbers have them. This is not you sitting down with a pencil and writing down a list. I always feel like that's an important clarification because yes. I always see Bill Connolly get yelled at online that, you're crazy. You think this team would beat that team? I was like, no, that's just what the numbers say. I'm just telling you what the numbers say. It's not a personal opinion. So that was, speaking of personal opinions, Nick Saban logged on earlier this week. He was on the Joel Klatt show, and he was looking at some of the numbers, and he was talking about, the quote was, but do you really get the best teams? Talking about the college football playoff. When they told me that we would be favored against 3 of the 4 teams that got into the playoff, I'm like, why aren't we in the playoffs? So, Tyler, you're a numbers guy, and I think we both probably look at numbers like this as having some, significant predictive value. Do you think that they should use, whether it's your ratings or the SP Plus or just the Vegas spreads? How big of a factor should that be in the college football playoff selection versus resume versus quality of wins versus whatever else the Gary Barta or whoever the commissioner, the college football playoff committee chairperson is at that given time, whatever they're talking about on those Monday or Tuesday night shows? Yeah,
I mean, again, I spend a ton of time working on the numbers, and I'm definitely a numbers guy from a predictive standpoint. And Nick Saban is right in the sense that, his team probably is favored over almost everyone almost all the time, but that's why they play the games. That's what makes college football what college football is that, sometimes the numbers don't work out. And that's just, variability in the statistics, of the numbers. So he is right. But also I don't think they should just say my numbers or SP Plus or whoever have these 4 teams as the top 4. So that's going to be the playoff field. I don't think you can do it that way because I think you still have to go out there and play the games and reward the teams that get it done on the field.
Well, and I'm trying to think back how many years it's been since Alabama or Ohio State would have been outside of the top 4 or 5 in SP Plus or one of those metrics where it's just you're coming in with such a heavy weight in terms of rank, in terms of recruiting, and then they are generally so dominant over the course of the season that, because a lot of times those recruiting rankings will filter out over the course of the season, but you're still so dominant over the course of the year that it takes a lot to knock one of those teams out of the top 4, out of the top 5. So then it becomes almost an auto berth if you're doing it that way. So
yeah,
that's and for an audience of Ohio State fans, maybe that's not such a bad thing. But for the rest of the college football world, there is some value in taking the on-field results into account for that kind of thing. And before I let you go, sports gambling now legal. This will be the first year sports betting is legal in the state of Ohio for the college football season. It became legal about 2 seconds after Ohio State missed a field goal down in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium to end last season. So looking at the numbers this year, I find the season win totals, the win total over-under is really interesting. These are just for the top, or just for the regular season. So this is just your 12 games. You're not including conference championships. You're not including college football playoff bowl games in this numbers. It's just for your 12 regular season games, how many games you're going to win. You have some really interesting numbers in there because a lot of times you'll hear bettors talk about finding value. Where is their value? And you have some numbers where you found some value. Where are some teams where you see the biggest potential gap in terms of what the number is and what your numbers say those teams are going to do this year?
Yeah, and a lot of times, and I've talked about this before, a lot of times when you're finding value, it's going to be on a lot of these group of 5 teams that no one pays all that much attention to or knows as much about. So in terms of value, like my top win total bet based on the value would be Florida Atlantic under 7.5 wins. I only project them at basically 5 wins. So that's, 2.5 games of cushion. If you're trusting my numbers, you're getting 2.5 games of cushion there for an under bet. Troy also is another one where there's about 2 games of value on their win total under 8.5. To bring it to something that's more relevant to Ohio State, I think Minnesota, who Ohio State plays this year, I've got them well under their projected win total of 7.5, or their win total over under 7.5. I've got them more at like 5.5. So that's a team. Colorado, Dion, Coach Prime, they come in, but they come in under their win total because their win total is 3.5 on the season. I've got them right at 2 wins this year. And that's even being very generous with how I kind of use their prior numbers to project forward. So that's being very generous, and I've still got them under. So if you're looking for a couple. There's a few, my sheet is online for free, so feel free to go through and look at all the ones that I found a lot of value on.
Yeah, I'll have a link to that in the post for this show on the front page of BuckeyeHuddle.com. But before I let you go, I did want to ask about Colorado and the challenges there, because this is like an unprecedented amount of turnover. So how much, did you just have to screw with the numbers? Did you have to just sort of say, well, the error bars on this are potentially enormous because who knows what this is going to be because there's so much turnover? How do you deal with a really unicorn, black swan kind of situation like Colorado this year?
Yeah, admittedly that was more challenging than pretty much all of the other teams who have had much more stability in terms of their roster and what they project to be from a talent standpoint. But basically for them, I look back over the last handful of years to see like, okay, what's this program's like ceiling generally? And kind of geared more towards that because I do think he will get it going there as much as you can get it going at Colorado. I also looked at how Jackson State actually had kind of transcended once they got him in the building. So it was difficult. It's probably not going to be as like pinpoint accurate as maybe some of the other ones just because of so much roster turnover. But I did the best I could with what information is out there, and like I said, with that much projected value, I still would feel comfortable taking an under bet on them. And I've seen several other pro bettors are in agreement with me on that as well.
Yeah, I don't remember who their third I think it's Colorado State, TCU and Nebraska non-conference, which that is there's maybe Colorado State, but there's not really multiple surefire wins on that non-conference schedule in the Pac-12. On the whole, pretty decent this year by and large. So yeah, that'll be definitely a team that a lot of folks are watching. Tyler, I mentioned I would put the link to the spreadsheet with all this information in the page on the front page post for BuckeyeHuddle.com. But let people know where they can find you on Twitter, because I find you a very, 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 very informative and entertaining follow on Twitter. Always some really good information there. So let people know where they can find you.
Yeah, certainly. Follow me on Twitter at BuckeyeTie23. I'm constantly tweeting out, any nuggets, any betting tips. All of my bets I document on Twitter, tweet them well ahead of game times, document my record, all of that. So I'm fully transparent there. And then, like Tom said, all of my stuff is free. I've got a full kind of college football guide that I just posted here Monday afternoon. So definitely take a look at that.
All right. So make sure you follow Ty, and also make sure you follow BuckeyeHuddle.com. We're on Twitter. We're on Facebook. We're on BuckeyeHuddle.com. We're on YouTube. We're all over the place. You can find us all those places. You can also find Ty on our YouTube.com/@CFB Playbook channel. He does some stuff with Mark Givler there. Oh, really, really interesting content there as well. So make sure you follow that, as well as YouTube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. You can subscribe to all that stuff for free. And then, of course, become a member at BuckeyeHuddle.com for just a little bit of money, but a whole lot of content there. Lots of great recruiting stuff going on right now with Mark and Alex. Kevin, Tony, and I covering the team. Our whole team of X's and O's gurus covering the scheme stuff, making you a smarter football fan, plus a fantastic community on our Huddle board, all at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.